name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Hello and welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We are so excited to have you here today. This webinar is Photography and Writing, Using Your Words to Become a Better Photographer. Harold says that writing has always had an important role in relationship to his photography. Not only has he used his words to introduce and explain images and techniques, but writing has also helped him to tease out the meaning in his work and to understand and explore what he needs to do next with his art. There's a long tradition of photographers using their writing as an adjunct and support to their visual work, and often reading what a photographer has written can be an important way of understanding their work. In this regard, you can think about Edward Weston's Daybooks. They come to mind. In this webinar, Harold will examine the relationship between his text and his work, and also take a look at this relationship in context of other photographers. Moving on, he will suggest some concrete paradigms that you can use to ensure regular inclusion of words, text, and writing in a coherent way as part of your workflow to increase the aesthetic richness of your own work. Many of you know who Harold is, but if you're joining us for the first time today, here's a little bit about Harold. Harold Davis is a best-selling author of many books, including most recently, Creative Garden Photography from Rocky Nook. He is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency, a Moab master, and a Zeiss ambassador. He is an internationally known photographer and a sought-after workshop leader. His website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now, I will hand it over to Harold.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. Let me share my screen before I go any further. Okay. So, yes, photography and writing. This is going to have three parts to it. Basically, the first part, I'm going to look at some of the photographers who've influenced me the most and how they've used their words and its relationship in part to some of their work. Then I'm going to move on to some of my own words, primarily in relationship to my blog. And then finally, I'm going to make some suggestions, as the description for this webinar said, about how you can use writing to help make your own photography richer. Very exciting to me to be here. Here's the black and white book that we did. It's our book before last. Here's Creative Garden Photography, our most current book. And at the end of the presentation, as usual, we'll put Rocky Nook discount codes for both these books up. The fuller title of Creative Garden Photography, the subtitle, is Making Great Photos of Flowers, Gardens, Landscapes, and the Beautiful World Around Us. So here's the table of contents that I mentioned for this webinar. So attitudes, Weston, Blosfeld, etc. To make a more complete list, we have, I will, if I get to them all, have words obviously from Ansel Adams, who's sort of the founder of writing and photography, Edward Weston, Carl Blosfeld, Eugene Smith, Guy Tal, a contemporary, Robert Adams, Galen Rowell, André Cortege, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Ernst Haas, Lilo Raymond, and we'll conclude with Minor White. So that's quite a collection there, and they're without exception wonderful photographers, as well as people who had some of them at least had quite a way with words. Following the attitude section, I will read and point to some examples from my blog, and then we'll look at some projects and exercises. I want to point out that during the section of this webinar, the first part of it, where I am discussing other people's work, I am not showing their photographs. I am showing my own photographs, ones that I think have some relationship to the work of the photographers involved or are homage of some sort. Okay, so without further ado, we will let this photograph represent Ansel Adams. Many people at this point, with the vast iconography and fame of Ansel and his imagery, don't realize that during the years when he was a reasonably well-known working photographer, but not particularly world famous, that his writing was what most people knew about him. He wrote a wonderful series of how-to books fundamentally, and books that describe technique of photography along with illustrations of some of his wonderful photography. So here are some pithy quotes from Ansel Adams. A true photograph need not be explained, nor can it be contained in words. This quote represents a theme that you will see running through the first part of this webinar, where the question is, do words help or hinder? Does a print speak for itself? Or does it help to have some description of it? The most important piece of equipment in the camera bag is a pencil and notebook. So that kind of seems to contradict the first one, that a photograph need not be explained. Okay, moving on. There is nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. Okay, sharpness is another concept that we're going to see revisited in a bit. The single most important component of a camera is the 12 inches behind it. In other words, the brain and vision of the photographer. And I don't know anybody who needs a critic to find out what art is. So this again leads to something that is going to be a theme through these questions. If you are going to write, is it prospective or retrospective? Retrospective writing by an art critic is, for the most part, as far as I'm concerned, not very valuable. I'd like to point to Adams's book, 40 Examples, the making of 40 photos. And in the text of this book, each photo, for example, I have a spread here with frozen lake and cliffs from the Sierra Nevada in 1932. Each of these spreads has really three sections. They start with the story behind the photograph, how he happened to be there, in this case on a Sierra club outing. Then Adams discusses the key theoretical issues that he felt were important in the photo, and then he talks about the technical issues. A fair amount of the technical issues in examples no longer apply, really, because they're wet darkroom things, what paper he used, what processor, what the enlarger setting was, and things like that. So let me just read a little bit that the theoretical part, the middle part in the Oreo sandwich here from Frozen Lake and Cliffs. Many speak of this image as abstract, but I was not conscious of any such definition at the time. I prefer the term extract with an E over abstract with an A, and I added the with an E and with an A, since I cannot change the optical realities, but only manage them in relation to themselves and the format. For photographic compositions, I think in terms of creating configurations out of chaos rather than following any conventional rules of composition. Edward Weston said simply that composition is the strongest way of seeing. At any event, I believe I was able to express in this photograph the monumental qualities of the subject that I responded to so intensely at first sight. In those days, I could imagine the composition and the desired values fairly well, but I did not then have the necessary craft to relate exposure and development precisely for optimum results. Perhaps he's being a little overmodest there. moving on, my Nautilus, it will serve to represent Edward Weston, who's my next selected writing target. So Weston said, "This then, to photograph a rock, have it look like a rock, but be more than a rock." Yes, isn't this the key issue, really, with photography? If you're going to be literal and capture something, how can you make it more than that something? Now, to consult the rules of composition before making a picture is a little like consulting the law of gravitation before going for a walk. Such rules and laws are deduced from the accomplished fact. They are the products of reflection. I would say to any artist, don't be repressed in your work. Dare to experiment. Consider any urge, and if it's in a new direction, so much the better. Make mistakes, get messy, try things. Any artist who's never failed has not tried hard enough. Photography to the amateur is recreation. To the professional, it is work, and hard work too, no matter how pleasurable it may be. Yes, that's really very true. I want to point to Edward Weston's famous Daybooks. This is in an Aperture edition. I'm not sure whether you can still find it or not. It's seen much reading by me. Copyright, second edition, copyright 1981. So this is sort of like Edward Weston's blog is really what it is, because what he did was every day he wrote in his daybook. Let me read from a section. But it does. I will go so far as to say that the camera is not mechanical, unless the photographer's attitude be mechanical. Lenses of a dozen different focal lengths can be used, completely altering the viewpoint of perspective, changing, even distorting nature at will, or revealing so much more than the average eye sees that the photography has opened blinds to a new world vision. So I really recommend the Daybooks of Edward Weston and reading them carefully. They're really a wonderful story, both of life and photography. I'm going to move next to botanical artist Karl Blosfeld. Here's one of my Blosfeldian images. There's a great edition of Karl Blosfeld, the complete published work, published by Taschen, currently in print, easy to get. He, of course, wrote in German. He started life as an apprentice in a metalwork factory where what they did was decorative scroll work. And his career proceeded with him doing reference photographs of botanical art to be used for things that were later made in iron. Eventually, he was recognized for his photography, and of course, the editions of the books published in his lifetime and his prints and gravures have become very collectible and very valuable, and certainly a wonderful artist. Reading from The Magic Garden of Nature, 1932, Karl Blosfeld wrote, "The plant may be described as an architectural structure, shaped and designed ornamentally and objectively. Compelled in its fight for existence to build in a purposeful manner, it constructs the necessary practical units for its advancement, governed by the laws familiar to every architect, and combines practicality and expediency in the highest form of art. Not only then in the world of art, but equally in the realm of science, nature is our best teacher." I commend Karl Blosfeld to you if you're at all interested in nature photography. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Eugene Smith. I was a bit at a loss as to what image of mine I could put up for Eugene Smith, because I've done many things, but I'm just not a photojournalist. Um, and of course, Smith was one of the great photojournalists of the film era and a Life magazine photographer and so on. So this is a picture of our crazy red sky here with the awful air from the fires we have in the Bay Area. It's sort of journalistic. I did, back in my first photography career, a few environmental journalist stories, including one which was involved visiting the disaster area at Love Canal in upper New York State near Buffalo, where I photographed some of the people who were still hanging on living there, and so on. And that was a very disturbing experience for me, and one that I decided I wasn't cut out to do. So this is one of the books that Smith, with his wife Eileen Smith, wrote and published of photography and stories. It's called Minamata, the story of the poisoning of a city and of the people who chose to carry the burden of courage. And in the preface to the book, Smith wrote, "This is not an objective book. The first word I would remove from the folklore of journalism is the word objective. That would be a giant step toward truth in the free press. And perhaps free should be the second word removed. Freed of these two distortions, the journalist and photographer could get to his real responsibilities. I well remember a confrontation with an editor of Life magazine in which he said I did not have the proper spirit, the proper respect for the needs of life, a proper belief in what life was trying to do. He said I was not being responsible. In the following 24 years, I have found no reason to change my answer. It was nearly identical to this. My belief is that my responsibilities within journalism are two. My first responsibility is to my subjects. My second responsibility is to my readers. I believe that if I fulfill those two responsibilities, I will automatically have fulfilled my responsibilities to the magazine. And that is the way we've approached the story of mercury poisoning in Minamata, Japan. We have put aside the possibility of being objective." Interesting, and I think very real point of view if you're going to undertake the emotionally, physically, and other aspects of being a journalist, particularly with things like disease and environmental disasters. For Guy Tal, a contemporary, I have run up a rock here, a rock at sunrise in Death Valley. And the point of this image really is homage to the title of Guy's book, More Than a Rock. So in the essay in More Than a Rock, which is incidentally published by Rocky Nook, Tal writes, painter Edward Hopper was known for his insistence on not discussing his work. Among his oft-quoted quips is this: if you could say it in words, there would be no reason to paint. What seems to have escaped him was that the opposite holds just as true. Things inexpressible in words cannot always be expressed in painting. So I'll skip a little bit here. I freely admit that my favorite artists of any discipline are those who also articulate their thoughts, motivations, and philosophies in writing. Moreover, my appreciation of any artwork relies to a large degree on my knowledge of the person who made it, their reasons for making it. Likewise, I believe that those who read my writings are better able to appreciate my photography. This is not to say that either one cannot stand on its own or that they are in competition, but rather one is often made richer by the other. Robert Adams, a fairly well-known photographer of the late film period, a fine art photographer, celebrated for photographs that celebrate the banal, particularly in suburbia. This is a cityscape in Italy that I put up for him. Not quite fair, but there you go. For photographers, the ideal book of photographs would contain just pictures, no text at all. Robert Adams wrote. He has a recount of how he once worked through more than 100 drafts of a 4-paragraph statement for a catalog, all to find something that would just keep out of the way of the pictures. So yeah, it's possible to caption things in ways that are not complimentary or flattering to a photograph, and one needs to be careful about that. Question is, does the thing speak for itself? In law, a nice Latin phrase is res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. Sometimes I like to think that's true about my photographs, but if I'm looking through my own photographs or other people's, a caption will add something, and certainly there's a reason that people are interested in learning the story behind photographs, that Phyllis and I make a point of really putting most of the stories behind the photographs in my books in there. So sometimes they speak for themselves, and bottom line is sometimes they do not. This is a sunset from Lambert Dome above Tioga Meadows in Yosemite National Park. I used it to honor the great photographer and mountain climber and adventurer Galen Rowell, who died all too young in an airplane crash on the Eastern Sierra. So I don't agree with some of the things that he liked to say, but I'm going to read some of the things I don't agree with anyhow. And then I'll read, so I have 4 quotes from Rowell here. And the first one I don't agree with, and the last one I think is a totally cool, interesting observation that it has a lot to commend itself to if one's thinking about what makes for a good photograph. So you get only one sunrise and one sunset a day, and you get only so many days on the planet. A good photographer does the math and doesn't waste either. So be there for every sunrise and sunset. I don't care how exhausted you are. Not. Small, portable digital cameras that exceed the performance of an off-the-shelf Nikon using 35mm slide film are further away from current reality than the proposed NASA manned Mars mission. Yeah, so he didn't really believe that digital was a happening thing. I'm sure he would have changed his mind had he lived a little longer. I began to realize that the camera sees the world differently than the human eye, and that sometimes those differences can make a photograph more powerful than what you actually observed. It's absolutely true. In fact, looking for those things where the way the camera sees the world are more powerful than the way the human eye is part of the trick to coming up with really interesting viewpoints in photographs. And here's what I think is the most trenchant observation. The most interesting parts of the natural world are the edges, places where ocean meets land, meadow meets forest, timberline touches the heights. Look for the edges. This one is a homage to the American-Hungarian photographer André Kertész, who came up with just some totally wonderful things that were unexpected. Kertész wrote, "If you want to write, you should learn the alphabet. You write, and in the end you have a beautiful, perfect alphabet. But it is the alphabet that's important. The important thing is what you're writing, what you're expressing. The same goes for photography. Photographs can be technically perfect and even beautiful, but they have no expression." So it's hard for me to disagree with that the real issue in photography is conveying emotion, not how perfect or technically imperfect a photograph is. And that will come back again in the selections I have from Henri Cartier-Bresson. He famously said, your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. So yes, practice, practice, practice. It makes a great deal of difference. Photographers deal in things which are continually vanishing, and when they vanish, there's no contrivance on earth which can make them come back again. I have found that to be so true, and it's true in unexpected ways. If you see something, stop and make the photo. That's really the takeaway there, because whatever it is, the light, the way the bush is floating in the wind, it's never going to be the same again. Sharpness is a bourgeois concept. Well, so I highlighted that in my most recent blog story about this webinar. I find that a very funny way of putting things, because there is something bourgeois about saying, okay, a photo's good if it's sharp. It's not good if it isn't sharp. And that's a very cut and dried kind of thing. You can put up a hierarchy and rank things by sharpness. You can judge them and contest, but you can't really say whether a sharp photo conveys emotion or whether an unsharp one does. For me, the camera is a sketchbook, an instrument of intuition and spontaneity, the master of the instant, which in visual terms questions and decides simultaneously. In order to give a meaning to the world, one has to feel oneself involved in what one frames through the viewfinder. This attitude requires concentration, a discipline of the mind, sensitivity, and a sense of geometry. Ernst Haas. Every work of art has its necessity. Find out your own. Ask yourself if you would do it if nobody would ever want to see it, if you would never be compensated for it, if nobody ever wanted it. If you come to a clear yes in spite of all that, then go ahead and don't doubt it anymore. Don't park. Arrival is the death of inspiration. The most important lens you have is your legs. The best pictures differentiate themselves by nuances, a tiny relationship, either a harmony or disharmony that creates a picture. Bored with obvious reality, I find my fascination in transforming it into a subjective point of view. Without touching my subject, I want to come to the moment when, through pure concentration of seeing, the composed picture becomes more made than taken. Without a descriptive caption to justify its existence, it will speak for itself. Less descriptive, more creative, less informative, more suggestive, less prose, more poetry. One of my teachers was Leila Raymond, and there's a book of her work. I think you might still be able to get it. Photography for me is a way of avoiding grown-ups, boredom, and going to the laundromat. It allows me to live in another world, intensified and of my own finding. I assume the right to stare long and hard, to be blunt, loving, and unself-conscious. I attempt to find a kind of poetry that eludes me in other more sober activities. It has become a continuous search with no shining end in sight, except to go on trying. My way of putting this, perhaps, is that photography gives me an excuse for being anywhere and doing anything. Last, but probably not least, I will read a poem of Minor White's. I delight in photographs. I delight in words. I delight in mixing both to see what happens if they bend. My pity for the pure photographer, my pity for the pure poet is tempered by the responsibility I have to 3 media, whereas they to only 1. So one of the themes that we've seen here is perspective against retrospective. Are you writing ahead to what's going to happen, or are you writing behind to what you've already done. And as a number of these quotes spoke to, don't get stuck in place. Before I move on to some of my own writing from my blog, Phyllis, is this a good time for a couple of questions, if there are any?
Sure. I've been, just so everyone knows, I've been putting links to every photographer and their books that Harold's been reading from now in the chat. So if you want anything, you can just copy and paste it into a doc and you'll have the links and everything. So Harold, there's a question from Jane. Do you think there are some photographs that speak for themselves?
Hey, Jane. Yeah, I absolutely think that. Hopefully some of my own do too. In some cases, a caption, particularly when it's very literal, it doesn't really add much to a photo. And I do always like to see the phrase copyright Harold Davis somewhere associated to a photo of mine. But joking aside, the best caption from my viewpoint adds a bit of poetry to an image. But isn't so totally fanciful that it has viewers spinning out of control saying, what is this all about? What does it have to do with what I've done? There's an art to the great caption. And yes, certainly some photographs speak for themselves. Hopefully, as I say, some of mine do. Though I think Minor White also had the right of it. To be able to be fluent in words and photographs is essentially a third discipline that's neither writing nor photography. Anything else?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, so moving on. In the case of Upper White River Falls shown here, actually when I posted it to one of my social media feeds, a viewer of the media feed sort of pointed me to Annie Lennox's song Cold, so these really aren't my own words. The stanza that involved is, dying is easy, it's living that scares me to death. I would be so content hearing the sound of your breath. Cold is the color of crystal, the snowlight that falls from the heavenly skies. So cold is the color of crystal, the snowlight is what is the tagline that I tagged this image with. And it adds a little bit of poetry as far as I'm concerned to a waterfall that with early winter runoff was indeed very, very cold. This is a image on a light box of a tulip that has lived perhaps past its prime. Using the term wabi-sabi is fair enough. I called the tulip Tulips That Were, and in a blog story called Love in the Time of the Coronavirus, written in March, in a very real sense, nature just doesn't care. Through years spent hiking in the mountains from Alaska to Maine, I've learned that however much one loves nature and loves being in nature, you just have to take nature as an extrinsic force that cannot be reasoned with. A storm at sea or a fall in the mountains can kill you perfectly and without an iota of consciousness. Anthropomorphism of the natural life force is, I believe, a mistake, unless intended as a metaphor. I've seen small blood-sucking leeches beside the trail in the jungles of Vietnam, blindly casting about for any warm-blooded creature, not because the leech is mean and ornery, but because that is what the leech does. This is much like the coronavirus infection particle. It just seems evil to us, but it is merely doing what it does. We're sheltering in place a family of 6. My parents in their 90s are alone in their own isolation behind glass doors. We bring them groceries, leave them outside the doors, wave kisses, and depart. They know that because of their age, if they're hospitalized, they'll be the first to be sacrificed. Shopping is an excruciating experience of mask and glove protocol. We're allowed out for an exercise walk, provided we keep 6 feet away from other people. This turns into an awkward social dance where pleasantries about hanging in there are exchanged while we subliminally jockey to see who will yield the right of way first. These are the worst of times and the best of times. I'm at home with those I love more than anyone else in the world, my family, and this too shall pass. Once long ago, when I traversed the Brooks Range in Alaska solo in deep fear for my life, I was granted a vision that let me know I would be safe. I was reminded of this when a few nights ago, deep in an anxiety dream about a vast car crash in which I was a passenger, the car I was in on a freeway swirled round and slower spirals. I kept waiting for the fatal crash, but it never came. Instead, I heard a voice. You will be okay. We will be okay. This is an image called Mountains on the Beach. Perhaps titling it at all with a caption gives away too much, but if you are wondering what you are looking at, note that the sort of tracks on the upper left are human footprints, not bird footprints, and that the white coming up on the lower left is surf. So I ran this with the artist statement that I've developed over the years. And at the end of this webinar, I may have a bit more to say about artist statements, but here's part of what I wrote. My work lies at the intersections of many styles and disciplines, between East and West, classicism and modernism, photography and painting, and the new technologies of the digital era versus the handcraft traditions of the artisan. To understand my imagery, one needs to see where it fits in each of these dichotomies. Before I explain, let me mention that my primary goal is not to evoke academic, scholarly, or pedantic understanding. I'd almost rather my work not be understood, so that the response is evoked on a primal level that is more to do with the heart and gut than the intellect. A great deal of thought goes into my work, but it shouldn't have to take thought to enjoy it. At the simplest level, I'm trying to evoke, at both conscious and unconscious levels, a sense of serenity, wholeness, and wonder. My work can be experienced and enjoyed simply and organically for its structure and beauty. With many of my images, unwrapping the sense of wholeness that the work conveys is not immediate. I'm asking someone experiencing my images to have the patience to contemplate and perhaps resolve a visual puzzle, but I don't necessarily let on up front that my viewers will be confronting a conundrum. I've called this image, alternatively, it's had two titles, Lonely Road and Poem of the Road. So in the what's the word? And from the perspective of beware of what you ask for, this is a short couple of paragraphs in a blog story called Greetings from a Peripatetic Photographer and Writer. And it was written mid-2019. I like to quote Yogi Berra's witticism that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Yeah, don't we know that one? But of course, we all make these predictions and plans regardless. As I look ahead at the new year, that would be this year, and contemplate both the needs of my family and how best to nurture my own artistic creativity, I do feel that cutting back on in-person teaching is almost certainly a step I need to take, at least for a while. Yeah, well, didn't intend it quite the way it happened, did I? This is a photograph, or if you will, an image that I titled after the name of the place from which it was taken, the Kimono Sansan Rupyaku Po, and probably that pronunciation was terribly mangled. Hiking the ancient Kimono Kodo Trail on the Kii Peninsula and Wakayama Prefecture in Japan involves a spiritual quest where walking itself is part of the pilgrimage, and the views themselves represent a spiritual and dreamlike landscape. During a short break in the very wet weather from Hayakengura, a lookout high on the trail, I shot this panorama of the Kumano Sansan Rupyaku Po, which translates to view of 3,600 peaks of Kimono. When the wind gusted, rain splattered my face and my camera lens and tripod, so it was pretty hard to make notes to keep track of the positioning of the frames in the panorama. It was wet and it was cold. I had to work hard to keep myself, and more importantly, my camera dry. But I realized that the weather was part of the spiritual scenery that makes the Kamano-Koto so special. And as Ansel Adams put it, you can't capture a clearing storm without being out in the weather. I don't think there are actually 3,600 peaks. It's important to remember the role of metaphor in life, particularly when you're on a pilgrimage. But as you can see, there's certainly quite a few mountains. This is a photograph in the NICU of Phyllis's hands and our daughter Katie. The thing to look at carefully here is the proportion of the hands to one another, the size of Katie's hands. So it comes under a cycle of stories I wrote on my blog, which were, as much as anything, therapy for me at the time, the story of Katie Rose. Phyllis was kangaroo holding Katie Rose, and I thought their hands together made such a great contrast of sizes that I snapped away. Katie has come such a long way and grown so much, but comparing mother and daughter hands reminds me she's still pretty small. Yesterday, she gained 2 ounces, and she's gaining quickly on 4 pounds. We started to hear talk around the NICU that is promising. Maybe Katie will be ready to move out of her isolette and into a bassinet soon. Maybe the hospital will schedule a medical meeting in a couple of weeks to start thinking about discharge plans. It all seems like a dream. Speaking of dreams, here's a digital photographer's surreal and dissonant moment. Last night I couldn't sleep. So I made a cup of chamomile tea and turned on the network and computers. At 4 a.m., I was working on the photo of Katie and Phyllis holding hands. There were no major exposure issues. But I did find that Phyllis's hands needed some work, and I knew she would never forgive me if I posted the photo without giving her a digital manicure. So there I was, sipping tea, smoothing cuticles, fixing dry skin, and rounding nails. Katie's hand doesn't need this kind of treatment yet. I've called this image a couple of different things, but the title that seems to have stuck is Romanesque Bridge Along the Camino. And the story that goes with this is called Beginning My Camino. This was my first trek on the Camino de Santiago. Today, I arrived to begin my pilgrimage walking to Santiago de Compostela. I'm to start tomorrow morning from Sarria. As you can see in the image, the river Sarria running through the middle of town is peaceful, but my traveler's adventures were not entirely so, as I'll explain. In the early morning, the bus picked up our group after a wonderful week's stay. It seemed like forever and no time at all. Leaving the group at the Toulouse airport, I headed for Santiago de Compostela via Madrid. Unfortunately, Iberia Airlines wouldn't check my suitcase through and said I had to retrieve it in Madrid and recheck it. A service would be bringing the bag each night to where I would be hiking. So of course my plane from Toulouse to Madrid ran late. Then my bag got lost somewhere in the Madrid airport. I ended up having to race the entire length of the huge Madrid Terminal 4, the last one on the plane just as the doors were closing. Of course, my absent without leave suitcase, whereabouts unknown, didn't make it with me. Well, a little bit of hardship is probably a good way to begin a pilgrimage. It kind of seems fitting to be stripped to my essentials as I begin, though I do miss my tripod, which was packed in my suitcase. I'm hoping my suitcase will catch up to me sometime in the next 2 or 3 days at one of the places I'm staying along the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage trail. I gave Iberia the details and they promised to find me. On the fairly long drive from Santiago back to Sarria, at first the road crossed and recrossed the trail. Then things thinned out and the vastness of the walk I'm undertaking became apparent to me. I think I had discounted the distances when I thought about this from home. It took a while even by car to get here. In Saria, I had a nice dinner at a pub around the corner from my hotel and bought a second pair of socks for my hard-working feet, an inexpensive raincoat just in case. I certainly needed it, I can tell you, and a clamshell, the pilgrimage symbol, to decorate my camera backpack. To be continued. One thing I would say about that kind of journaling as one photographs is don't wait too long to do it. If you don't do it more or less at the same time as you're doing it, you won't remember how it felt, what you experienced, or even the details. You pretty much have to do it same day. You can make notes in a notebook, write it down using something as old-fashioned as, a stylus, a pen, or a pencil on paper, and then later transcribe it. But you really have to do it as you advance. This is an image of Yosemite Valley called Alone I Stand, and I'm using it to illustrate a cycle of blog stories I wrote back in 2005 called A Walk on the Wild Side. It's amazing how easy it is to leave our everyday world and enter a completely different universe. This other universe is one where issues are simple: survival, not falling down a cliff or into a hole in the snow, being warm and dry, having enough to eat, and if you're 50-ish with kids, not having a stroke or heart attack alone in the wild. Yeah, well, I'm no longer 50-ish, but I still have kids. The wilderness is grand and majestic and magnificent, but it's utterly alien to us and doesn't care in the least about us and our concerns, our well-being, or whether we live or die. Depending upon how you look at things, this is either comforting or terrifying or both. Hikers do vanish every year in the Sierran wilderness. For example, probably no one will ever know what happened to Fred Klassen or Michael Fisseri, other than that they died. Perhaps it's a good time to start making clear the mistakes I made on my journey through one of these cracks into the alternate universe that is the wilderness. First, I wasn't really paying attention when people, such as the reservation ranger, told me about all the snow and how empty the Sierra wilderness was this year. I also wasn't taking the time to get adjusted to the change in altitude. I drove from sea level to about 7,000 feet in one day and then started hiking up. No wonder I didn't feel so good. My head was pounding and my breathing labored. Stay tuned for one big whopper of a mistake to come, though obviously I'm here to write about it. As I continued up the snow crossing, starting to get more and more difficult and scary. Some were undercut with fast running water, and I knew a collapse was possible at almost any time in these conditions of brutally hot sun and massive snowfields. This was the last I saw of the trail for many miles. It vanished under a snowfield and didn't reappear. I began to wonder why I hadn't brought proper gear for traversing snow, an ice axe or at least crampons. Gaiters would have been nice too, though more a matter of comfort than safety. At some point, I realized that I'd lost the trail in a terrain of infinite snow and steep cliffs, and that it was probably too dangerous to go back down the way I had come. Well, getting myself into this predicament may have been a foolish midlife crisis blip kind of thing. But once there, I do have to say without boasting that my wilderness navigation skills are good. I don't know whether it's my Eastern European Jewish ancestry or my Native American progenitors, but I can find my way anywhere. Blindfold me, spin me round and round, and I still know my directions and how to go any place. I also know how to read a map. It's probably not genetics at all, just one of those things that some people do and others don't. But it's a good skill to have if you're ever caught in a snow-clad wilderness empty of people. Amen. And the thing about adventures is that they're always wonderful looking back, even if in real time going forward, they have some very uncomfortable aspects. This is Son Doong Cave, the world's largest cave in Vietnam, and the start of my cycle of stories about Vietnam. In 2017, I visited Vietnam with my longtime friend Eric. Our ostensible goal was to visit the largest cave in the world, Son Doong. Along the way, we saw many strange and wondrous things, starting with the Long Bien Bridge that was important during the American-Vietnamese War because it connects Hanoi by rail with the port of Haiphong. Moving from one conflict zone to another, this is an image called On the Cover, or sometimes cover model, and the reason is that you can see this gentleman that I photographed on the left there on the cover of the Lonely Planet Guide to Cuba. And I did a cycle of stories about Cuba, about a dozen stories or so, called 50 Years After the Cuban Revolution. This is the prologue. And to find out more about the stories involved, you probably will have to go to my blog. On a humid and unseasonably hot day in March of 1957, 42 men armed with submachine guns, carbines, and automatic pistols crammed into the back of a small delivery truck. Two other vehicles, a Buick sedan and a Ford Roadster, each with 4 armed men in shirt sleeves, accompanied the van. The assault on the presidential palace was on. Inside the dark and hot van, the men debated about contemporary art. One was a painter of realistic scenes. Another painted only abstracts. Comrades in revolutionary arms, they could not agree about the goals or methods of painting and bitterly fought the academic battle between realism and modernism. Another pair of men played chess on a small set by the dim light filtering in through the crack between the rear doors, with onlookers kibitzing in whispers. At the presidential palace, dictator Fulgencio Batista waited in the Salon de los Espejos, the Hall of Mirrors, reading The Day Lincoln Was Shot by Jim Bishop to pass the time. Brutal tyrant and pawn of the American crime syndicates, Batista knew the attack was coming, if not exactly when. He expected a night assault. In the corrupt climate of Havana, it was absolutely impossible to keep a secret, and an informer had given the outlines of the conspiracy away in the torture chambers of Batista's secret police. Through sheer shock and surprise, the first wave of the assault overpowered the guards at the gates of the presidential palace and proceeded up the marble stairs to the Hall of Mirrors on the second floor. But Batista had fled to the upper reaches of the presidential palace, sealing the way behind him. Meanwhile, the guards had regrouped outside the palace. Most of the rebels died on the marble stairs of the presidential palace. The blood ran down in streams into the neighboring park, where bullets chipped nearby buildings and accidentally killed an American tourist. Of the 35 men who made it into the palace, 3 made it out alive. By the way, Fidel Castro had nothing to do with this assault on the presidential palace. At the time, Fidel was doing his guerrilla thing in the mountains, listening to the news on his scratchy shortwave radio. "Comrades," he announced, "something big is happening in La Habana." He later deplored the action as a useless waste of human life. This is called The Road Less Traveled. The long and winding road takes the road less traveled. When I lead workshops, I often find myself repeating the common saying, "Want to make more interesting photos? Put yourself in front of more interesting things." This is fair enough. As Ansel Adams memorably put it, sometimes I arrive just when God's ready to have someone click the shutter. Planning and researching can increase the odds of arriving at the right place and time. Planning tools on my iPhone also make this easier to achieve than it used to be. But I think a more important idea is that to make a more interesting photo, become a more interesting person. Really, a photo is a manifestation of how we see, and our vision is one of the most important characteristics of who we are. Sure, anyone can occasionally make an interesting or beautiful photo, just as a monkey pounding on a typewriter might occasionally bash out a Shakespearean sonnet. But to consistently create interesting and original images requires becoming a more interesting person, and past a certain point, the work created even serves to sum up who one is as a person and an artist. This is a little analogous to George Orwell's dictum, that at 50, everyone has the face they deserve. In other words, since I've been at it a while, my work as an artist and photographer can be said to be the face I deserve. My work in large measure defines me, although of course I'm also a husband, father, and lover of wild things. The definition works both ways round. My work in part defines me, and who I am defines, energizes, and bounds my work and gives my art the power it has. To fully understand my art and the man behind the lens, one needs to understand the unique path I've taken, which is definitely a road less traveled, and learn a bit more about who I am. And a couple more. This one is called Salutation to the Sun, and it's part of a guest blog post that I wrote for another blog on beauty and art. What is beauty? What is the place of beauty in art? Surprisingly, these are contentious and difficult questions that involve some very slippery concepts. In the past couple of centuries, since the end of representational art as the ultimate goal of the artist, the role of beauty in art has become increasingly vexatious. This is particularly troublesome in the context of photography, which necessarily has some representational components, and the rise of the hegemony of conceptual art. Conceptual art backs away from the epistemology of beauty with a preference to shock, which works as long as it does shock, but not much further. Furthermore, the confluence of digital imaging with photography has moved photography away from its literal and representational roots, but this vertiginous movement is still vestigial, and popular imagination has not quite internalized just how unreal and potentially fantastic all photography is. If everything is fake and absolutely nothing can be verified as real, then what signposts are there along the way to mark the real? Picasso put it this way: art is not the application of a canon of beauty, but what the instinct in the brain can conceive beyond any canon. When we love a woman, we don't start measuring her limbs. Which needs to be understood along with another pithy Picasso epigram: art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. In other words, if one can completely name and grasp beauty, then it is probably not the ineffable beauty of exalted art, but rather the degraded beauty of the cliché art and artist. The truth that can be named is not the full truth. Beauty is more than skin deep, and true beauty demands at least some element of mystery. And for conclusion, an image that I called Gates after Rodin in a blog story called A Rorschach for MFAs. This image, with the working title Gates after Rodin, shows one model many times. The model, Jacques Fishburne, is a self-described tornado disguised as a woman. Is a self-described tornado disguised as a woman. In the studio, Jacques was posing on a large metal hoop, sometimes called a lyra. The lyra was suspended by two ropes about 6 feet above the ground with a black background. For some of the exposures, Jacques was kneeling on the ground, quote, holding up the lyra. To make the image, I shot 5 in-camera multiple exposures with auto gain turned on so that each multiple exposure was properly calibrated. Each of the multiple exposures consisted of 5 to 8 individual shots, with Jacques changing her pose between each one. I used basic studio lighting for an even, consistent look. I then combined the in-camera multiple exposures in Photoshop, using both stacking and selectively pasting bits from various versions using layers and masking. By some ways of counting, this makes for a total of somewhere between 25 and 40 different captures of Jacques when you multiply the number of files by the number of times she appears in each. Before finishing the image by adding a texture, I retouched out the ropes from above, holding the lyra, leaving the circular lyra mostly in place. A friend writes, It brings up associations with 5 or 6 classic paintings from earlier eras. I see the winged victory of Samothrace on the left and the hand of the Sphinx on the center right. Cardinal Richelieu is in the center. The face and profile at the upper left comes from something I can't quite place, and the depictions of hell by the famous painter, what's his name, are at the bottom, Hieronymus Bosch. And then there's the hint of the Sumi E circle of light again, the Lyra. It's like a Rorschach for MFAs. My own association is with Rodin's Gates of Hell. I saw a casting in the garden at the Rodin Museum in Paris this spring. Maybe the memory of the gates was lurking in my subconscious, waiting for a chance to emerge. Before I move on to talk about my suggestions for projects and exercises, are there any questions so far, Phyllis, that I should deal with?
Well, there's actually a question from Jim. Do you think writing about photography has changed since the film era? Is it different in the digital era?
Hi, Jim. That's a very difficult question to answer, isn't it? I mean, I think that our era of technology has changed all kinds of writing, just not writing about photography alone, because really it's so easy to write and get it out there and posted, you know, per the strong suggestion of starting a blog. So people such as myself feel enabled and powerful in writing in a way before that, until you got your work published, nobody would have seen what you wrote. So yeah, I think so. And I think that photography is also of interest at some level to a far wider circle of people than it probably was in the film era. You know, in the film era, it was gatekept a bit more, like the quotation and story I read from Eugene Smith about all the trouble that he had with his editors at his employer at Life magazine, who really didn't want to publish things as hard edge as he wanted to create. Probably today he would have said, to heck with you guys, I'm going to go do a crowdsourced book and put it up on my blog, and it's your never mind. But back in those days, the powers that be, was part of a big corporation. The powers that be would carefully curate and gatekeep the words that went out. Thanks. An interesting question about which I'm sure a lot more can be said. Anything else, Phyllis?
Not right now.
Okay, projects and exercises. I do hope that there are some clarifications or questions about this. Some form of daybook is, I think, essentially a necessity. I recommend a blog. You can easily set up a blog on one of the subscription blog sites, such as WordPress. Doesn't have to be a lot of technical efforts to do it, and keep it regularly. Okay. And it doesn't really matter to me whether it's a diary or journal for yourself or a blog that you expect other people to see, but relate it to your photography and do it, if not once a day, do it once a week, but keep doing it. I mean, my blog has been going at this point since 2005, and probably with an average of about 10 to 15 stories a month. That adds up to literally thousands of stories. Some of them, of course, are ephemera or advertisements for workshops or whatever. But the real bottom line here is that that's a huge amount of words that I can draw on as a resource, even when I write books, for example. Many of the stories about images that go into the captions in my book come from what I originally wrote about the image in my blog. An artist statement is something that if you go and see galleries, you will be expected to have. It's something to approach with some degree of caution. It's a good word. I'm not a great fan of fluffy artist statements. What you really should use the artist statement for is a chance to boil your image, you boil your practice down to its basics. You know, if you could do your artist statement in one paragraph, so much the better. Doesn't need to be something that you go on and on about. Shorter is probably better. I do think it's a great exercise and something that should be redone from time to time. You know, it's not like one artist statement and you're done. The issue of captions going with images, there are obviously some photographers, Robert Adams comes to mind, who'd rather not caption anything. The thing speaks for itself. Res ipsa loquitur. I know some contemporary photographers who you never can figure out what the heck their caption is talking about. In fact, occasionally, Phyllis and I joke, yeah, I mean, you know, once or twice I've done that myself. I've picked some totally preposterous phrase. I don't know why it goes with this image. That really isn't fair. It's not fair to the image, and it probably isn't fair to one's conversation with the viewer either. But, you know, to caption that image of mine with the two roads, with the trees and the fog, the road less traveled, adds something to the image. To caption the tree in Yosemite, alone I stand, adds something. So, you know, with sunset at Lambert Dome, well, people want to know where an image like that was made. When I was a young photographer in my first photography career, I showed my portfolio to a very well-known, subsequently famous art director. It might have something to do with Life magazine. I won't mention any names. Anyhow, one thing that Loengard said to me was, why are you showing me this photo, in response to a specific photo? And I really learned from that, because that's always a good question. You always should understand why you're publishing or showing an image. What is the image about? Why is it shown in this context? You create the context that you're showing an image in, and in that context, why are you showing this photo? So that's a question that you should always be able to answer. The final piece of advice is to keep at it. Both writing and photography, as almost anything that has some elements of craft and difficulty, benefit from practice, from doing it over and over again, and routinely having, but writing as part of the discipline with your photography benefits the photography, benefits the writing, even if the writing never sees the light of day. All right, I'm going to say goodbye. Keep writing, keep photographing. If you write a blog, send me a link, please. I mean it. And stay creative. Bye, everyone.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.